My name is Glenn Howard. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 11th Annual Terrorism Conference. We're honored here today to have as our keynote speaker the 26th National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, HR McMaster. HR McMaster is a native son of Philadelphia and has served his country with great distinction, like his father before him who had served in the Korean War. He is a 1980 graduate of the Valley Forge Military Academy and has gone on to have an exemplary military career with commands in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Upon graduating from Valley Forge Military Academy in 1980, H.R. McMaster entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and graduated from there in 1984. 7 years later, he found himself in the Iraqi desert fighting in the 1991 Gulf War. In February of 1991, he participated in the famous tank battle with Iraqi forces known as the Battle of 73 Easting, where he was awarded the Silver Star for a battle which his armored unit destroyed more than 80 Iraqi tanks. In 2003, H.R. McMaster returned to Iraq with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment serving in the Tal Afar province in northern Iraq, where he ran a textbook counterinsurgency campaign aimed at ending insurgent sanctuaries. Tired of fighting Iraqi insurgents, H.R. McMaster decided to fight a new insurgency in the corridors of academia by earning a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina. Now Tar Heel alumnus, McMaster made the jump to the warrior scholar with his 1997 landmark book, Dereliction of Duty, a book about leadership and conscience and the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Vietnam War. In 2014, H.R. McMaster was named by Time magazine on its list of the 100 most influential people. HR has those rarest of qualities, battlefield experience and intellect. This background and experience made him the perfect choice to become President Trump's National Security Advisor. Since he became National Security Advisor, one of the things I've recognized about H.R. McMaster is that he is out of the box in his thinking and appreciates the value and role that D.C. think tanks and outside organizations play in Washington, and particularly in providing advice to U.S. policymakers. 10 months into the position, he has fervently, and by my own account, reached out to at least 5 different D.C. think tanks in an effort to communicate U.S. strategy. Now, why would you think that he might do that? The answer could be found in his award-winning book, Dereliction of Duty, where he wrote, "The war in Vietnam was not lost in the field, nor was it lost on the front pages of the New York Times or the college campuses. It was lost here in Washington, D.C." Indeed, one of the distinguishing features of H.R. McMaster is that he has appreciated a role of understanding languages and cultures. Before the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment deployed to northern Iraq for its 2nd tour, HR made sure that his men were immersed in the languages, history, and culture of the regions in which they would fight. In the desert of northwestern Iraq in 2005, HR arranged basic Arabic language instruction for many of the soldiers beforehand and assigned them readings on Arab and Iraqi history. Prior to his deployment to Iraq, HR ensured that 1 out of every 10 soldiers in his unit received a 3-week course in conversational Arabic so that each small unit would have someone capable of basic exchanges with Iraqis. Jamestown shares a similar attitude in its approach to research and analysis. Just as HR ensured that his men were immersed in foreign languages and history, Jamestown also ensures that its readers are immersed with indigenous-sourced analysis, utilizing the languages of the regions of the world that are important to the national interests of the United States and help our U.S. policymakers make better informed decisions. That, in short, is the mission of the Jamestown Foundation. Next Monday, the Trump administration is preparing to release to the public its new national security strategy, and we will learn more about what the vision of the United States will be in a post-ISIS Syria and Iraq. H.R. McMaster is the driving force behind that strategy, not to mention as well Nadia Shadlow, a great friend of Jamestown as well, and much of that vision that he will be developing with the national security strategy has been shaped by his own experience on the ground in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And after the downfall of ISIS and Raqqa, we certainly look forward to hearing today how the United States plans to tackle these threats in a new post-ISIS world. With that, I'd introduce H.R. McMaster.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thanks to all of you associated with Jamestown for your outstanding leadership and scholarship in helping us understand better the very complex national security and international security challenges we face. So your foundation's commitment to rigorous research and analysis in international affairs broadly and on counterterrorism in particular informs policy around the world. We have drawn heavily on it and will continue to do so. And so thanks so much for the great work that you do. And thanks especially for the invitation to attend this year's terrorism conference. For over a decade, this conference has convened scholars and practitioners to enhance our understanding of terrorism, extremism, insurgency, geopolitical factors, and many other key issues and factors that bear on our security. And recent attacks, as we've seen just in the last couple of weeks across the globe, from West Africa to the attack in New York City here just last week, reminds us all of the critical importance of your work and of this conference. So, of course, today's panels are going to be a real treat. I wish I could stay here with you. I'm looking forward to the report later. But are comprised of some of the most accomplished thinkers and scholars. I won't name all of you, but it's such an impressive lineup, and I really appreciate the great work all of you have done, really to protect our nation and all humanity from these terrorists who are enemies of all civilization. So this morning, I'd like to discuss with you the Trump administration's new national security strategy, the President's national security strategy, and implications for our approach to counterterrorism policy. I'll do this very quickly because I'm really anxious to hear what's on your minds, what advice you have for me, or what you'd like to see, what you'd like to discuss. Our national security strategy, the President's national security strategy, focuses on 4 pillars. First, to protect the American people and the homeland. Second, to advance American prosperity. Third, to preserve peace through strength. And fourth, to enhance American influence. The strategy is designed to confront the realities of the world and prioritize problem sets and situations in the world based on our vital national interests, which broadly correspond to those 4 pillars of the strategy. The first pillar, of course, emphasizes protecting our citizens and our homeland, but recognizes that our security in today's interconnected world is inexorably connected to security abroad and the security of our allies and partners in particular. Chief among the threats to our American citizens and our homeland is the threat from jihadist terrorist organizations. And the Trump administration has prioritized defeating jihadist terrorist organizations and has directed us to deny terrorist control of territory, populations, and resources, to cut off their funding, and discredit their wicked ideology. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I recommend reading the President's speech that he delivered earlier this year in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where he laid out those 3 critical aspects of the strategy. So the strategy will accord with those 3 tasks, the national security strategy and a counterterrorism strategy, which will follow shortly after the national security strategy. First, we will act early with allies and partners before terrorists gain significant political or territorial control overseas. We cannot wait until terrorist organizations have the capability to control territory, populations, resources, generate revenue, use safe havens and support bases to organize, plan, and conduct attacks, broadly, but certainly across the sea to our nation. So we have to prioritize efforts against networks, though, that threaten the United States and our citizens abroad. We recognize we can't be everywhere against every terrorist threat, so certainly we'll prioritize those threats based on those organizations, those terrorist organizations that aim to attack Americans and our citizens abroad. Second, we will use all available tools, intelligence, military, law enforcement, information, economic tools, to target these networks. And as the President said, he wants to cut off all financing to these networks. But what we have to do is do even more than that by trying to understand better, and this is where your work has become so important, understand better the flows through these networks internationally of people, money, weapons, other important illicit activities such as the flow of narcotics or precursor chemicals or smuggled fuel, for example, that helps generate funds for these organizations. and to attack these networks holistically, essentially isolating these networks from sources of strength and support and attacking their weaknesses, physical weaknesses, but also psychological weaknesses as well, and political weaknesses. And the President, as you know from the Riyadh speech, encouraged partners to take responsibility for driving terrorists out of their communities and their nations. The United States wants to help catalyze this coalition of partners who share our aim of defeating jihadist terrorist organizations and other terrorist networks. I think we're making tremendous progress in this area. For example, this year the United States was pleased to support all 6 GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, in the establishment of a terrorist financing center in Riyadh. They're already doing important work. We'll continue to expand those efforts there. And the Senator recently issued the first ever GCC-wide sanctions against ISIS or Daesh and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so as we go after these networks, we have to deny them all sources of support. We have to deny them the ability to travel, to communicate, to mobilize. And the strategy recognizes that defeating terrorism requires us to look beyond the terrorists themselves, to again, isolating them from resources and support networks. How and where are these organizations connected to entities that are not a formal part of that organization, but who enable that organization, who are the beneficial owners of companies who launder their money, who provide them cover for action, who provide them with impunity. Third and finally, as the President said in Riyadh, we have to defeat their wicked ideology. And again, this is where Jamestown's work has been invaluable. We have to combat this ideology that inspires terrorist attacks, that recruits impressionable people to the cause, most often youth who are seeking affirmation, to whom these murderers appeal. In Riyadh early this year, the President called on all nations to stand in universal condemnation of radical Islamist ideology, an ideology that perverts religion to justify murder and unspeakable brutality against innocents. So these are the 3 main areas of focus for our counterterrorism strategy. And we've already begun implementing the strategy around the world. As you've seen, across the greater Middle East, our Defeat ISIS coalition has recaptured over 95% of territory previously held by ISIS or Daesh in Iraq and Syria. None of that territory has been returned to the control of ISIS or related groups. And then, as you see, really across the world, from Afghanistan, we're defeating terrorist organizations and preventing mass murder terror attacks against the United States before they occur, alongside courageous Afghan partners who we should note have made, as well as Iraqis have made in Iraq, as Syrian Democratic Forces have made in Syria, tremendous sacrifices, as have our incredibly courageous servicemen and women. In Afghanistan, you've seen that with our Afghan partners, that we have already retaken 2/3 of ISIS Khorasan territory in eastern Afghanistan. The United States is also working alongside Afghan forces to defeat the Taliban, an extremist organization that supports terrorists like al-Qaeda. As one of my analyst friends says often, sometimes we try too hard to disconnect the dots. And in recent years, we created this myth, that there was this bold line between the terrorist organizations and the Taliban, for example, Haqqani Network, and those who enable them. And of course, in Southeast Asia and Africa, the United States is also working to deny these terrorists control of territory and resources, prevent these groups from gaining footholds as they're defeated in their so-called caliphate in Iraq and in Syria. For example, the United States provided, I think, invaluable support to the Philippines in their successful effort to liberate Marawi City from the grip of ISIS terrorists. And again, this is a fight in which courageous Philippine soldiers encountered a very difficult enemy in dense urban terrain. And of course, we have to remain vigilant to prevent the spread of these groups and their depraved ideology, for example, in Southeast Asia, where we've seen these groups much more active. These efforts demonstrate the President's commitment to defeating these terrorists who are enemies of all civilized people. The President has been clear that defeating terrorists and their ideology is a core national security priority, tied again to this first pillar of the forthcoming national security strategy. We, of course, need allies and partners in this fight. And again, in Riyadh, the President highlighted the need for us to cooperate, and you see that we're already doing this in these three areas: to drive terrorists out of all nations, to cut off their financing, and defeat their wicked ideology. I could talk more about accomplishments and what we're doing next. I'd like to leave that for question and answer, but of course we all know there is much, much more to do, and we need you. We need the combination of scholars and practitioners that the Jamestown Foundation convenes to continue to think deeply about the sources of terrorism, to identify new methods of countering its spread and influence, and to share how we can learn from each other and be more effective at accomplishing these three fundamental tasks that the President has laid out for us. I want to thank you again for this invitation to speak at your now historic conference on terrorism. I'm looking forward to our discussion, hearing your thoughts and your advice on how we can be more effective together to secure our nation, to secure all nations and all humanity from this grave threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, now we'll have a few questions and answers, so we'll start here from the floor. Sir, what is your name, and can you reach into the mic or talk to the mic? And what's your?
Sure, thank you. Don Barnett. I'm with Center for Immigration Studies. Question about refugee resettlement.
I think the mic is working. Is it on? Okay, talking to the mic.
Sorry, Don Barnett. Question about refugee resettlement. Do you feel like it's a vector, specifically to the U.S., for terrorism, and are we doing enough to vet refugees that come in?
Yes, well, refugees are obviously a population that terrorists try to exploit, like they try to exploit any opportunity. And you've seen that the President in his policies has emphasized extreme vetting, making sure that we know who is coming into the United States so we can protect our citizens and our homeland from those who would infiltrate among refugees to attack our people and to export and really gain access to us for violent purposes. But really what the President has done and directed our relevant departments and agencies to do is to provide full support to deal with this refugee crisis. As you know, the United States remains the #1 donor to care for refugees, to provide them with basic services, and has emphasized doing so as close to the point of crisis as possible, where, of course, you get a lot more relief for your dollar, and you also have the benefit of having those populations in closer proximity to their homes so they can return and help stabilize areas, regain their lives in areas that are cleared from terrorists who brutalize them and cause them, or in the case of the Assad regime, a hostile regime that's committing violence against its own people. So refugees is a big part of a security effort. It's a humanitarian effort, but we also recognize that it's also a top priority to prevent the growth and strengthening of terrorist organizations.
Let me go to this side. Gentleman right here, raising a hand. Shahab. Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning.
Please identify yourself.
Shahab Makahla, Director of Geostrategic Media from Jordan. I'd like to ask you a question about the recent decision of Donald Trump regarding recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel, whether this would be affecting extremism and terrorism in the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I just want to thank the Jordanian people for the tremendous work that they've done on the refugee crisis in particular, and to provide support for so many who suffered the worst trauma you could imagine. And Jordan has been immensely generous and a tremendous partner to work with for us, but really a real advocate for acting to alleviate the humanitarian suffering. As you know, the President's decision on Jerusalem follows the policies of many presidents who have deferred this decision with, I think, 46 waivers based on congressional legislation, and congressional legislation that was affirmed just a few months ago by a 90-0 vote in the Senate, which, of course, you know, happens very rarely these days in Washington, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. As the President said in his speech, and I would just ask those who have questions about his decision, just to go back to the text of his speech, which laid it out very, very clearly, that this is a recognition of a fact. This is where Israel's seat of government is. It's where their president lives, their prime minister lives, and so the decision no longer to not to waive that the movement or of the embassy there, and to announce actually Jerusalem as the capital. And to make plans for the movement of the embassy there at some point in the future, as soon as it can be constructed, was in keeping with the policy of many presidents. I think the key thing to highlight is that there are a couple things that it doesn't change, right? It doesn't change any of the territorial boundaries within Jerusalem. It doesn't change at all the administration or access to the religious sites there, and it leaves these issues for a final status agreement. And so what the President hopes is that this decision can be used to actually generate more momentum in the peace process. And he has not in any way diminished that as a priority for his administration. He knows that this is really up to the parties to agree, to the Israelis and the Palestinians, and hopes that there will be an opportunity to use this as a way to advance the peace process.
I'd like to ask a quick question, sir, about how do you perceive the development of ISIS? As you know, they need safe havens, and we've now trying in the effort to deny them a safe haven. So where do you see, you know, the future of ISIS in safe havens? Do you see areas like Africa and the Sahel becoming more in our strategic sphere of, you know, interest and deterring these groups and going after them?
Yes. And what you've seen is the movement of ISIS to other areas after the defeat of ISIS in their so-called caliphate in Iraq and in Syria. And of course, West Africa is an area of concern where you've had really competing radical ideologies, some funded by Iran, others of a Qutbist or Salafi jihadist ideology that is shifting, I think, the psychological, ideological landscape in West Africa and makes some of these populations more vulnerable. And the movement of some of these fighters back into West Africa. You've also seen movement into portions of Libya, though, where I think we have effective operations along with partners. The U.S. has a very small role there, obviously. But then also into Egypt. You know, we've seen movements into Egypt from these groups, which is what we can expect to happen. There's a continuing concern of the freedom of movement some of these groups enjoy across Iran, back and forth into Afghanistan and Pakistan, for example. And you see that this is a problem set that interacts with Iran's support for terrorist organizations and militias, I believe, in an Iranian effort to perpetuate this fitna or sectarian civil war in a way that strengthens terrorist organizations and creates chaotic environments that allows Iran to portray itself as a patron and protector of Shia populations in particular, and to create essentially and perpetuate state weakness across the Arab world. Essentially what Iran has done is interacted with jihadist terrorist organizations, Salafi jihadist or Qutbist ideology that underpins these organizations, to create and perpetuate this cycle of violence and have weak governments in power in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. This was what I have in mind, I think, had in mind in Yemen as well, who are dependent on Iran for support, while they create militias and other illegal armed groups that lay outside of that government's control and can be turned against that government if that government acts against Iranian interests. And so we have a problem set that goes beyond these particular terrorist groups, and we have a problem set that is not confined to any particular geographic area. And so what we've done is continue to work with allies and partners. As you know, France has taken a lead role in the G5 Sahel area, and we're happy to support that important effort there. And I think it just highlights the importance of all of us working together to understand these networks internationally and flows through these networks across broad geographic areas. Do everything that we can to interdict them and to do the three things President Trump asked us to do, right, which is to deny them safe haven support bases, cut off their financing, and defeat their ideology.
Thank you. The gentleman right here, a question? You've been waiting. Yes. Right.
Blake Vieira. I'm a diplomatic intern at the Kurdistan Regional Government Representation, and I'm also with the Enough Project. General McMaster, if you don't mind, I have two questions. First, will the national security strategy outline ways to facilitate peace between the Kurdistan Regional Government and the government of Iraq? Secondly, what concrete steps is the U.S. going to take to deny the proliferation of the Shia Crescent in Syria and Iraq? Thank you.
Okay. So the national security strategy is a foundational document that will provide a broad foundation for what we are calling integrated strategies to address more specific national security challenges. So it won't address every problem set that we're prioritizing, but resolving and the crisis, you know, the problem between the Kurdish regional government and Iraq is a big priority for President Trump and for Secretary Tillerson and the whole team. And as you know, that the United States is very committed to the success of the Kurds in Iraq and more broadly, as you know, since 1991, with Operation Provide Comfort, we helped prevent further atrocities and brutality aimed at the Kurdish populations in northern Iraq. And what happened? You know, you saw the Kurdish region flourish. I mean, it's a miracle almost what happened in northern Iraq in terms of the growth of beautiful cities in Sulaymaniyah, Erbil, and Duhok. The return of populations to those regions, a vibrant but fragile economy, vulnerable economy. And so what we want is we want the success of Iraq. We want an Iraq that is strong. We believe that Iran, for example, who has been very successful in infiltrating and subverting Iraqi institutions, functions, organizations, wants an Iraq that is perpetually weak. We think an important aspect of Iraq being strong is resolving this conflict and tension between the Kurdish region and the rest of Iraq. And so we're committed to do that. We're committed to the territorial integrity of Iraq and also the territorial integrity of the Kurdish region. And so we are committed to work together with Kurdish leadership and Iraqi leadership, mediate as best we can, and to also limit the destabilizing influence of others in the region who would use this tension for their own benefit, and that would be the Iranians in particular. And you saw how the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran, for example, was able to exploit the differences between factions within the PUK, really, and then between the PUK and the KDP. And so I think the Kurds broadly, the leadership has to recognize that it's vulnerable to this kind of nefarious activity on the part of the Iranians, but they enjoy our support, as do the Iraqis, in resolving these tensions, strengthening the Kurdish region as part of Iraq. Thank you.
Let me go here. Michael, you have a question. Kavukian.
Michael Kavuk, John White and Case. It's a tough question. How the hell do we deal with North Korea?
Yeah. Hey, they're all tough questions these days, right? Yeah. Well, I think it is difficult and maybe impossible to overstate the importance of this question and the danger associated with North Korea and North Korea obtaining nuclear weapons that can threaten the whole world. And so what we have to do, I think, is consolidate our efforts and push our efforts forward around the three main accomplishments of President Trump's first visit with President Xi in Mar-a-Lago, I think in March or way earlier this year. Seems years ago, but just months ago. And those were first that North Korea is a threat to the whole world. And previously in dealing with the North Korean threat, many tried to sort of sidestep the problem and not have to cope with it themselves by portraying it as, well, this is really a problem between the United States and North Korea. And I think there's broad recognition now, inescapable recognition, really, that North Korea is a threat to the whole world. And so, of course, what's important about that is that can lead to global action, international, not just condemnation, but action to isolate that regime diplomatically, economically, and convince Kim Jong-un that this continued pursuit of nuclear capability that can threaten the world is a dead end. The second key thing about this is that, about the accomplishments in Mar-a-Lago that we followed up on, is a recognition that denuclearization of the peninsula is the only viable objective, the only acceptable objective in North Korea. And of course, in the past, again, sidestepping the problem, you would hear, well, really negotiations are an end in themselves. And I know there's some reporting yesterday about Secretary Tillerson said we're open to initiate negotiations, but those negotiations are not, or talks, are not an end in and of themselves. And there would be no preconditions to those. What he said, when there would be no preconditions, what that means is we're not going to alleviate, we're not going to relieve any pressure on North Korea or give in to any demands they might make for payoffs, because this is a regime that uses extortion on a routine basis, as part of their policy. So denuclearization is the only viable objective, and if we all focus on that, we have a strong chance for success. And then the third is China's recognition that it does have a great deal of coercive economic power over North Korea. And I mean, the president has said at times, hey, if China wanted to solve this, they could do it. I mean, they could do it. And so I think associated with that is China's recognition that it's in China's interest. I mentioned it's in everybody's interest to cope with this threat and to remove this threat. But China, I think, recognizes now, we hope recognizes now, that it's in China's interest to do more. In the past, it was often portrayed as, hey, we're asking China to do us a favor, but that's not the case at all. I think China recognizes that it's in China's interest to cope with it, not just because of the direct threat of a nuclear-capable North Korea, but also the inevitable and almost inevitable breakdown of the non-proliferation regime in Northeast Asia, and what that means for China's interests.
This lady right here. And please identify yourself.
Thank you, General. I'm Rita Chen from the Central News Agency, Taiwan. My question is also about Asia. Let's focus on the Asia. And we also see the China showing their muscle, such as like sending the aircraft carrier and the fighter to encircle Taiwan and close to the Japan's ADIZ. I'm just wondering, do you have any concern about the China's aggressive action? Is Americans' interest to seeing China doing this? And second question is America is going to release your national security policy. I'm just wondering that is Taiwan playing any role in the Indo-Pacific region, the strategy that you will have? Thank you.
Well, first of all, the United States, as you know, is committed to freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight, not only in the South China Sea, but everywhere. And it is nobody owns the ocean, right? And so I mean, the country that has benefited most in recent years from freedom of navigation is China. So in our discussions with China on this topic, we highlight this is certainly in our mutual interest. Any kind of coercive military power that's used to restrict freedom of navigation cuts against not only American interests but against the interests of all countries in the region. And I think that our partners in the region have been pretty strong about this as well. A key aspect of the free and open Indo-Pacific policy and the U.S. approach to the region is that what America wants is strong sovereign nations who protect the sovereignty of their own citizens and don't infringe on the sovereignty and rights of their neighbors. And it's on that principle that we're basing not only our defense and security cooperation relationships all the way across the Indo-Pacific region, but also our economic relationships as well. And I think if a speech to point to is the President's speech at APEC, where I think he articulated that vision very, very clearly, and our commitment to working together with allies, and we have very important treaty allies in the region, and partners broadly across the region to advance our mutual security, but to enhance our prosperity, but to do so in a way that advantages China. I mean, it doesn't disadvantage China as well. The national security strategy won't talk really about specific policies or strategies, but it will underpin all of our strategies. And I think what's relevant to the Asian Pacific region in particular is under protect the American people and their homeland. It's the kind of security cooperation that we've seen with the Philippines, for example, and with others in the region, with Indonesia, who we know has a very good program for countering radicalization. And so we recognize that those kind of strong partnerships overseas are critical to our security at home. Under promoting American prosperity, what is most relevant for the Asia-Pacific region is an insistence on fair and reciprocal trade and economic practices and access to markets to ensure that no country can use a mercantilist policy to achieve unfair advantage and then use that unfair advantage, for example, to pose a military threat with the gains from unfair trade and economic practices, for example. In peace through strength, which is the third pillar, we will emphasize the strengthening of our alliances and the need, though, for all of us to share responsibilities and burdens more fully. And you see that already happening, largely motivated by not only President Trump's call to do more and to share more of a burden, but also from the threat from North Korea, of South Korea increasing its defense capabilities at breakneck speed. I mean, on path now to spend over 2.5% of its GDP on defense. And of course, you saw it with Japan also developing capabilities to protect Japan from this growing threat from North Korea. Again, all reasons for China to recognize it's in China's interest to do more. And then finally, the third pillar, advancing American influence. We think that cooperation with others is critical to our national security. And it's cooperation with an expectation of reciprocity. And we think that's reciprocity on our end as well as our partners' ends. And I think if you read the national security strategy through the lens of the Asia Pacific, a lot of those aspects of the policy will be readily apparent and relevant to the region.
Right here on the front row. And then we'll go back to this young lady here.
Michael.
Hey, Michael. Hi.
Good
to see you again.
A quick question on the spread of nuclear power programs in the Middle East. So since the signing of the Iranian nuclear agreement several years ago, we've seen a proliferation of not nuclear weapons programs, thank God, but civilian power programs in the Middle East. The Egyptians are borrowing $25 billion for the Russians, and the Russians will be building a power plant near Alexandria. The UAE, as you know, is completing its first 4 power stations, and now the Saudis have announced that next year they want to tender for 2 nuclear power plants. Do you have any proliferation concerns when you look at that situation, and do you see it as a response to what the Iranians have been doing?
Yes, we do have proliferation concerns associated with this, and it is connected to Iran. And what we often hear is well, how can you expect more of a particular country than you expected of Iran under the JCPOA, for example? So I think one of the key things is to assure everyone, all interested countries, which is, I think, certainly everyone in that region, that we're determined to block all Iranian paths to a nuclear weapon. And you've seen that with the president's policies. You've seen that with his critique of the JCPOA, which he often calls the worst deal ever, and in particular is concerned about the lack of monitoring and enforcement. He's concerned, obviously, about all sorts of things that lay outside of the deal, such as the missile program. And he's concerned maybe primarily with the sunset clause. And of course, I mean, how well does anybody trust the Iranians here? You know, I mean, the Iranian regime here. And so the greatest danger would be that if the Iranians could use this agreement as cover, right, for a clandestine program. And so, as you know, the president is addressing all of these with allies and partners, and we're trying to remedy parts of this problem through domestic legislation and a shift in this so-called INARA legislation, and we're working with Congress to do that. So the first thing to do about this problem of potential proliferation in the Middle East, which would be disastrous just like it would be in Asia and Northeast Asia, extremely dangerous to all humanity, is to block all Iranian paths to a weapon and make sure everyone knows what we're doing, not just the U.S. but the international community, to ensure that Iran cannot pursue that capability. And then the second thing is, I think any nation that provides civilian nuclear capability, we all have to demand high standards to ensure that the non-proliferation regime remains intact. And of course, there are those who, in the interest of cutting a deal, will relax those standards. And I think this is an area, like in so many areas with Russia, where our interests overlap, where we need a much higher level of cooperation. This is an area of cooperation that we need with China and all others who provide that kind of capability.
We're going to take one. We've been told we have time for one more question. What we're going to do here is, Luis, you had a question. Wait for the mic, and then we'll take 2 questions at once here and try to get them into one.
Louise Oliver, former U.S. ambassador to UNESCO. Both China and Russia are currently being governed by very, very strong leaders. Are you at all concerned about a growing relationship between those 2 countries and where it leaves the U.S. if that happens?
And then question here.
Thank you for coming today. We really appreciate it. I'm Michael Ryan from the Jamestown Foundation. I want to ask you a question about a subject that Jamestown spends a lot of time on, emerging groups. After the Benghazi attack, the Senate report, flashing red, faulted the intelligence community for not paying enough attention to emerging jihadist groups that could be dangerous. But of course, the intelligence group doesn't pay attention to it unless the policy offices, specifically your office, is interested in it. Right. I just want to know what you think about that, with the shattering of ISIS, proliferation of Al-Qaeda, and anonymous Muslim Brotherhood under arms in Syria.
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, on the question of Louise's question on the growing relationship between Russia and China, what we hope is that Russia and China will both act in the interests of their own citizens, but also in the interests of the international community broadly in the key topics that concern us. We think with both countries we ought to try to do 3 things: counter anything that we see as aggressive or destabilizing behavior, and that's from a security perspective or from an economic perspective. For example, with Russia, we are increasingly concerned with these sophisticated campaigns of subversion and disinformation and propaganda the use of cyber tools to do that. I mean, as you see, have you seen that this is a really sophisticated effort to polarize democratic societies and pit communities within those societies against each other and create crises of confidence and to undermine the strength within Europe. And you see this most recently with the Catalonia independence referendum in Spain, for example. You've seen actually initial signs of it in the Mexican presidential campaign already. So I think that this is an aspect where we want to confront destabilizing behavior with Russia, as well as areas where they're using conventional and unconventional military forces as well. But much of what Russia's been doing, that's in our view destabilizing, is below the threshold of a military response. But the second thing we need to do with both countries, obviously, is to prevent conflict with them, to deter conflict with them. And that's to do with a classical approach to deterrence, in which, as Thomas Schelling said, the most effective means is deterrence by denial, right? Knowing that those nations know that they can accomplish objectives that affect our vital interests through the use of military force. But increasingly, there's a need to deter aggression in other domains as well. Cyberspace, obviously, is one of them, and space is becoming a contested domain. So there are increasing complexities and dangers associated with these power relationships that we have to be concerned about. But the third thing that we're trying to emphasize is to find areas of cooperation with both China and Russia. I mean, how could it be in either China's or Russia's interest to have a nuclear-armed North Korea? It's not. We should be able to work together on that. How could it be in the interest of either of those countries, or in Russia in this case, to perpetuate this horrible humanitarian and political crisis in Syria in a way that empowers Iran and risks a further destabilization of the region, greater threats to Israel? I mean, how is that in Russia's interest? We should be able to work together on that. So it's finding areas of cooperation with China and Russia that we're emphasizing across all of our policies. Of course, from a geopolitical standpoint, I mean, you could say that this period of time is analogous to the early 19th century, and when Mackinder was writing about ensuring that the world island, the Eurasian landmass, is not dominated by any one power. But I think we're less concerned about that than we are about the really pragmatic work we have to do across those three areas. Counter destabilizing behavior and aggression. Second, deter conflict. And third, though, to find areas of cooperation where we can advance our mutual interests. On Michael's question on emerging terrorist groups, you're absolutely right about this. I think for a while we fell into a comfort zone of focusing almost exclusively on designated terrorist organizations and not doing enough work against the broader landscape of emerging threats, and to go after these threats while they're nascent and in the early stages of growing sort of ideologies that justify violence, that foment hatred, that perpetuate ignorance among some communities, to foment hatred and justify violence. And so what we're doing is reorganizing our efforts internally in three areas. The first is prioritizing jihadist terrorist organizations, which we think remain a grave threat to all of us, and these are groups associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth, but also state-sponsored terrorist organizations, which are mainly sponsored by Iran in this case, but other states, as you know, support terrorist organizations such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, but we're concerned about Hezbollah, Hamas, and this broad range of militias that use terrorist tactics and perpetuate conflict across the Middle East. And then a third category would be other terrorist and extremist organizations that we think represent a nascent threat. The other aspect of this is to be able to map and understand networks more broadly than these designated terrorist organizations, and to understand in particular funding of extremist organizations such as those that you see funding mosques and madrasas and civic organizations in West Africa to the Balkans to Southeast Asia, and to be able to go after those financial flows Much of this work, I think, is the work that you do here. It's just pulling back the curtain on it so we can expose those who are financing these sorts of groups as well. But it's a great question. I agree that we cannot afford to have a myopic view only on designated terrorist organizations. When the situation with Qatar and the GCC emerged, it was sort of a wake-up call for us a little bit, in that we and our partners in the Gulf were talking past each other. We went to our data on terrorist financing. They were talking about the funding of other extremist groups that they viewed as a greater threat. Some chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. So it's an area where we need your help, certainly, and of course, you know that to apply a lot of the tools that we have available, which include targeted economic sanctions, travel restrictions, even, or minor things like visa bans, or what evidence that we need for investigations and prosecutions, and the application of extraterritorial jurisdictions, Interpol red and yellow notices, sanctions under UN 1267 authority. We can't use compartmentalized intel for any of this, right? So the open source research that's done, business intelligence that's available to us is very important. In the case of state-sponsored terrorist organizations, we think that cutting off the financing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran is immensely important. And so any work that can be done on identifying the beneficial owners of Iranian companies, so as many companies rush to Tehran with their checkbooks open for business deals with the Iranian regime, that they are not strengthening terrorist organizations that pose a grave danger to the region, and that not only the Middle East but the world as well. And that's another area that I think we should focus more on, is how the Iranian regime finances its destabilizing, destructive, and murderous behavior across the Middle East and beyond.
Thank you, sir. Well, we understand that you've got to go, and so we'd like to thank you very much for appearing today and before us, and just appreciate it very much. So give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.